we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
We are here today with Agnes da Costa, who's the head of Regulatory Advisory Office for the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy. Agnes, welcome to Energy Impact.
Hi, Brett. Nice to meet you. And I'm very proud and honored to be here talking about Brazil and the energy sector.
No, it's great to have you. I mean, Brazil's always been a fascination of mine. I was out there a couple of years ago at an energy conference. And so it's really exciting to be able to explore the space further. But before we talk about the energy landscape today, we'd love to just learn a little bit about you. Can you tell us, where did you grow up and what got you into the sector?
Okay, so I'm really a multicultural person. I have an Indian, French, and Brazilian background. And I went to German schools. So this is very different. I am the melting pot in person. And then I studied, I have a bachelor in economics. And when I was studying economics, I started studying energy economics. And this is where I fell in love for the energy sector. And so I have been passionate about this area since my 20s, more or less.
But help me understand why more, like why economics? Did you remember anything specific about, was it your parents or who, like how did
No, it's not really the most noble reason. It was because I'm a very curious person and I love everything that I don't know, study, read. So then I read once in a magazine about a generation of young millionaires in Brazil, and all of them studied economics. So
there you go.
But then I went to a different university. This was not a university focused on the financial sector where these people gain money. It was an university focused on industrial economics. So that's why I learned about infrastructure, energy, and then this university is the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, is also very focused on economic development. And then when you think about a developing country and the role that infrastructure sectors, energy may play in developing, in inclusion, it's enormous. And this is why I fell in love, because I saw that studying this and working with this, I could add and help the country to move forward in this agenda of development. And then we are so lucky in the energy sector in Brazil that this agenda comes also with a lot of sustainability. So this is very good.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Can you tell me maybe though, if you can just think back to the early days of your career, something that as you became a specialist in the sector surprised you, something that maybe the average person and you didn't know until you got deeper into it?
No, I think one thing that people, I don't think they really understand, but this is more curious for people working with infrastructure, is the amount of money and investments that we are dealing with.
Yeah.
So it's always billions. It's always billions, and you sometimes lose a bit of the sensitivity and to see that how big this is, but this is the world that we live in, and with the numbers and figures that we work with.
And that's just because it's things are just so big, like the physical structures of energy systems, the wires, the land, it's just big. It's a lot of stuff that needs to be moved.
It's a lot of stuff. Now, with the technological innovation in the industry, specifically in the power sector, we see more modular energy generation projects. that make things also not that big, but then you have always to pull things together, supply, demand, and then the figures are big, enormous again.
Yeah, you always end up getting big again. So walk us through your career a little bit. So you studied this, and then where did you go to work?
As I studied economics, and then I decided to take a master's in energy, because it was more technical and I had to learn more about thermodynamics and those things. So I took the master's, and after I ended, having studied economics, I always thought about if I wanted to work with economics, I should work in a bank or in a financial institution or in a government. So I first went to a bank. So I worked in an investment bank before. And it was good. I entered as a trainee, so I had the opportunity to work in several areas, but I ended up working with project finance for energy. So because I had this background for my master's, but then I had a bad luck, and there was an intervention in this bank, and I was so sad. But
what does intervention mean? Is that government what is
yes,
intervention?
government intervention. The bank filed afterwards bankruptcy, so it was really a bad luck. It was not in my plans, not at all. But then this is how I ended up coming to Brasilia, because then the minister at that time was building the team for the Economic Advisory Office, and she was looking for people with this academic background.
Yes.
So and then it's very interesting, because Brasilia, for people who don't know Brazil, it's like in the middle of the country. So several people.
It's like a more desert environment, right?
Yes. People working in São Paulo and Rio sometimes don't want to move to Brazil, but I had lost my job, so I came to Brazil.
Yeah. And it's a planned city, right? Like I remember looking at a map once, and like a very interesting layout. It's like this curve. Yeah.
Yes, it's a very nice city to live in. You know, the life quality here is very good. You don't have traffic. You have a lot of open spaces, and you see the sky from everywhere. And it's a modernist city, so you have a lot of concrete in the buildings. It's very beautiful, the design. So everybody that comes to Brazil, I always say you should come for a weekend to Brasilia, because it's something so unusual. But the first week I was living here, I was depressed, and because this is such a different city, and you don't see people walking on the streets, because it was built in the 60s for cars. So it's different, but then I love it now.
Amazing. So tell me, you entered government, and then like what do you work on? What was important at the time?
I started in this Economic Advisory Office to the Minister of the Mines and Energy. So I have been advising ministers for the last 16 years. But I had not that much experience. So I was learning how to design public policies. And then in Brazil, we have something like in France, to become what we call the officials or public servants with public servant status. You have to pass like a concourse. So I passed this concourse afterwards. And it's a career that is very interesting, because we can work, in fact, in several ministries. But I always stayed in the Ministry of Mines and Energy, because I know that the expertise that you have to work with this area is so big. And I gained so much experience that I thought it would be a waste of resources
to move somewhere else,
from our taxpayers if I decide to work on tourism or other. So I stayed here, and I love it very much, because then my experience at the beginning was with the first sector reform of the power sector reform from the years 2003, more or less, after the energy rationing that we have in 2001. So I was working more or less with the design of these power purchase agreements and the design of the energy auctions that became really a benchmark in the world for a best practice.
Okay, I want to get to the technology innovation for the bulk of this episode. But before we do, I need to learn a little bit more about what was going on when you first started with the market reform. Why were there power issues to begin with? And because it seems to me like Brazil is a very natural resource rich country. How could you not have energy? What was going on?
No, so then back into history. So the power sector in Brazil grew built on big hydropower plants, and they are all over the country. and they supplied for, in 2000, for more or less 85% of the power demand in Brazil. So our power supply at that time was mainly big hydro, some thermal power plants, and an enormous interconnected transmission grid. Because this is how we can benefit from the complementarity of the hydrological regimes in several basins throughout the country. So, but then we had like a period of very low rainfall, and this is why we had then this energy rationing coupled with a market reform from the late 90s, where we opened the market for private investments. But private investors were waiting to see how prices would develop. And then the price volatility, when you depend on hydro resources, is very high because it depends on the rains. So no new investments came in time to avoid the energy rationing from 2001. So we had this reform from the 90s. This one mainly focused on privatization. So we privatized a lot of distribution companies, but generation and transmission kept still state controlled, and the state was broken at the time, so they didn't have money to invest in further projects. And the opening of the market, the expectation at that time was that private investors will come and invest in new projects, but this didn't happen. So then in 2003, the new reform was, how do we attract private investments for expansion projects?
Yes.
And this is when we designed the energy auctions coupled with long-term PPAs, and also coupled with the what we call the previous environmental license for hydropower plants and for all generation projects, but mainly for hydropower projects. Because from the 90s to the year 2000, what happened is several private developers wanted to develop hydropower projects, but they had problems in getting the licenses, and this didn't move forward. So the projects didn't become a reality. So with this change in designing the auctions with long-term PPAs and the environmental license as a requirement for participation in this auctions. And the auctions were then a way of pulling demand together from all distribution companies. At that time, distribution companies is what we call our regulated market, accounted for, I would say 75% of the market. Now it's, we have been opening the market. So nowadays, the regulated market accounts for more or less 63%, I think. But there is then a way forward in opening the market, and this is the reform that I'm working on
now. And so tell me, when you open the market, who do you open it to? What's that other remaining 40% that the energy?
No. So there are already 40% in the open market. So people who can procure energy from who they want, from projects, from, I don't know, commercial traders, from anything.
And do they still operate on the exact same infrastructure? So the transmission system is the transmission system, but then like you can be a private purchaser of power in one location, but then maybe the generation asset is somewhere else. Is that the idea? Okay.
Yes, and traders everywhere. So we have the single transmission system, and it's centralized, operated by a single operator.
And then, but what is the how do you operate across that transmission network? Do you just pay a fee if you want to buy power from somewhere else in the grid? Do you just pay a fee based on the distance it travels, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's not. It's that you pay fees, but it's not like in US that is really, it really is what we call the marginal locational price. It's not really marginal, but it's like more or less in Europe, we have sub regions in the system. This kind of fees. So you have to pay the fees for transmission and for distribution if you are connected to the distribution grids. And this was the main step in the reform of the 90s. So they separated the access to the grids at that time, but the investment for generation didn't come. So,
and so why didn't it come? What was missing?
No, at that time.
All right. This is the previous time. I see. And so what are the reforms now that you're looking to enable to further open up the market?
Okay. So what we are doing now is we have to think that more consumers want to be free to choose from where to buy energy. So it's really thinking about the empowerment of consumers. But then we have to think how we redesign the business of power distribution in Brazil, because power distribution in Brazil is supply and grid. So we have to split the activities. We have to redesign the tariffs to have like multiple part tariffs and those things.
And when you say tariffs, you mean tariffs internal within the country?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Tariffs. When I say tariffs, it's like paid by end consumers. So what they
and who is the end consumer in this case? Is it like a steel plant, or is it like an individual, even like a household?
Oh, it can be both. So let me try to explain this differently. If you are connected to a distribution company, you have to pay the tariff, energy tariff. So this is the energy that supply, the supplier part, and the grid tariff. But if you are a big consumer, that you are eligible to procure energy directly from a supplier, this is the 40% of the market more or less, then you just have to pay the grid tariff to the distribution company, and you pay directly the energy that you buy from any supplier.
And the grid tariff, like approximately how much is it? Is it 10% the cost of energy, 50% the cost of energy?
The grid, I would say in distribution more or less 30%.
Okay, right in between. Okay, that makes sense. And then are there certain who's driving the change? Like, why make this change? Is it because industry is like giving you the feedback, hey, we want it to be more open, or is it some other motivation?
No, there are several aspects. I think one is technological innovation. So I think, and people always talk about the 3Ds of the word disruptive. I talk about 4, but okay. So decarbonization, we have all this renewables and also distributed generation as well. So this distributed generation comes with the decentralization of decision-making in the power sector as a whole. And then digitalization. So now what we see is that consumers can be more efficient if they want. And it's very hard if you have to think in a more centralized way, that we design the auctions, the government, distribution companies, they have to procure their market 5 years ahead. And they have to think how big will be their markets. And then we have to pull all the suppliers that want to sell. So this works, but it's very rigid. So with all these changes that we are living in the sector, there's no need for this anymore. But thinking that Brazil is different from mature countries, where we still have a lot of consumption growth, both in energy, but also in power a lot. We still have to think about energy planning in Brazil. Our energy planning is like, we call it indicative. So we look everything that's available, what are the scenarios, because we have to design still the auctions for energy procurement. But when this changes with time, that people procure their energy or their megawatt hour a lot for their own, we have to think that maybe there won't be enough energy, or maybe the projects are not coming, or maybe people are not planning ahead, I don't know. Then we have to think on what we call in Brazil is the separation between energy, so supply of megawatt hours, and what we call lastro. Lastro will be more or less like capacity. Mm-hmm. So we are designing how to procure the expansion that doesn't come from the market itself. And this will probably still be based on auctions, but then it will be paid by everybody, by all consumers, independently if they are still regulated because they want, or independently if they are procuring their own energy through probably a fee. So this is what we are designing.
And when you do capacity planning for the future, how do you decide how much of each source of power from the different types of energy?
No, we don't. So this is another change in this reform. One is embracing technological innovation. The other is embracing the empowerment of consumers. The third one is embracing technological neutrality. Okay. So what we want to say is, we see how this sector can evolve, what kind of energy sources there are, what technologies there are, what would be, I don't know, the lowest cost scenario. We have several scenarios. And then what we want to say is we want to procure megawatt hours. We want to procure megawatt hours in the most critical hours of the month, in the most critical hours of the year, so that from the supply side, they can develop business solutions to provide for this. So this, we have already done this in a more controlled scenario, which is our interconnected system covers the biggest part of the country, and I would say, I don't know, 80–90% of the market, but we have still isolated systems there in the Amazon region where you cannot take the grids, it's too far away and too costly. So there we also do auctions. So distribution companies, they more or less say how much they think that their market will grow there with the population and the needs in the areas. And we design the auctions, and there is where we are buying what we call supply solutions. So we say, we need this kind of curve of power production, and then we come. So at the beginning, the isolated systems, they were only supplied with fossil fuels. And this was very expensive, very polluting. And then with this source of procurement through auctions of energy supply, we have been facing several innovative ways of supplying energy. So, for example, hybrid projects with gas and solar. So this is very interesting because we think that the private sector can come up with the solutions. In fact, we don't have to think about them.
And how do you get gas into a more isolated region? Do you have to build a pipeline?
These two boats, we call them barcaças. I don't know, big boats. So
the LNG, like the LNG boats. Okay, I see. Okay, so the boats come up. And these isolated regions, I see, they still have coastal access, essentially. They're not inland, they have coastal access?
Yes, the rivers, they go all to the...
Okay. Oh, so you're bringing gas on a boat across a river, not just from the ocean.
Yes, sometimes, yes. I'm not the best person to say exactly where it is, but they do.
And how much does the price of energy vary from region to region right now?
So if we talk about the regulated market, so the distribution companies, it depends on the auctions where they procured energy, or what we call their energy portfolios, because this is what we call like a pass-through. So they buy there, they have to declare what they need for the years ahead. And when they buy from the projects that are there. So it depends on in which auctions they bought their energy and which projects were there to supply the energy. Then there is the grid cost that I would say it's comparable to the world, but something that is expensive in Brazil, taxation is very expensive. So, and we have, like, it's a federation like the US. So we have from the federal level, from state levels, and they vary a lot among the countries. So it's very differently, and some municipal taxes as well, but mainly. So for example, there are some states where the state taxation accounts for more or less 40% of the bill. It's a lot.
Wow.
So,
and what about let's say for new auctions coming up, what do you expect the PPA price to be set at for the generator itself?
Oh, it varies on the products, because if we have renewable, they are always much cheaper. But now we have the Congress just passed a bill in which they want us to continue procuring also thermal power plants for two reasons. One is because of this drought and the dependency that we still have on not only hydro.
Right, you need dispatchable power. It's not enough to just have power when the weather wants to give it to you. You need to be able to dispatch it when you need it.
Exactly. So for this reason, and also because our congressmen think, with some reason, that this kind of project can also induce development in their regions.
Yeah.
For example, not only because of the power plant, but also because of the grids that come and all. And then when you have the gas grid, you have then also the use for gas for the industries and all this development.
So give me a sense of that. So for a thermal power plant, what would a competitive price be for a generator to come to the country and say, I've got a thermal power plant for you?
I don't know in dollars. I'm not, I think about 350 reais per megawatt hour, but it's very bad to compare with our exchange rate. So I don't know if this gives you a sense of
I'm doing a conversion right now. Okay,
yeah.
67. That's about, that's no, oh yeah, okay. That may be a little bit high, but for other, for what we see other
But
places, but actually not too much. Yeah.
And for a new power project generator, so
yeah, that's actually not bad. Now I think about it, and then something we're always interested in is nuclear energy. Does nuclear energy play a role in Brazil's future?
Oh yes, it plays, but we have already 2 nuclear power projects in Brazil. They account for more or less 2.2% of our power supply. And there is one, it's like the one in the UK that is taking long to be built.
Oh, this is Angra 3 or something. Yeah.
Yes, but it's really, we are moving forward this year to resume the construction works of this plant. But what we see as a future as well is what they call the small
modular reactors. Yeah.
Yes, because this is something that we can think that is more distributed. And when we think, for example, like these isolated systems, why not? So if this development occurs and it's non-emitting, so we are very interested in seeing and supporting how this industry move forwards. Also because Brazil has large reserves of uranium. Yes. And this plays also a big role in what we call the internalization of the fuel cycle in Brazil. Yes. So and then
who looks into this? Is this the role of the Ministry of Mines and Energy? Do you guys have like a special task force?
Not alone. No. For the Angra 3 project, we are working together. It's the Ministry of Mines and Energy, but also with the Ministry of Economics. But in terms of the nuclear policy, it's more what we call the Casa Civil and what's the name? It's at the presidency of where the president is, that they have like special areas dedicated to this as well, and also the Ministry of Science and Technology, of course.
Got it. Very cool. And then so you were mentioning that you are right now developing the new policy. Tell me just more about like the legal system in Brazil. How does it work? So do you guys you put suggestions forth? Is there then a Congress that votes on? What happens? How does it work?
Legal system. So when we talk about energy, from the Constitution, energy is a subject that is addressed at the federal level. It's not like in the states, in the state level. So the energy policy is a federal level issue. So what we do when we want to design policies, there are several ways. The Congress can always propose bills, but we can propose what we call the provisional measures. They are bills proposed by the government that have to pass very quickly or they get abandoned. And this is how we usually foster shifts in policy when we need them with more urgency. Then when we have the bills, and then these bills, they have to pass 2 houses as well as in the US. And it's a very complicated process. We have to meet a lot of compromises. It's the same thing with the thermal power plants, as I mentioned to you, because this was a bill dealing with the privatization process of Eletrobras, the power sector holding company. It has nothing to do with specifically energy planning and those things. But then, because it was from the energy sector, congressmen thought this was a good moment to discuss this as well. So then we have to meet a lot of compromise to accommodate several needs that come from Congress, but they are also legitimate, I think, now, because these people were elected and I think they speak for several of us. So then when we have the bills, what we can do, I think it's the same in US, the ministries can propose presidential decrees to the president, and then he signs the decrees. So usually we we detail the way to apply what is in a bill through a decree.
Okay.
And then there's another level are the ministerial orders. So we have also the ways of legislating through ministerial orders in smaller issues or more detailed aspects of the laws. So this is
are these separate processes, or do they all layer on each other and work with each other?
on each other, but there is a hierarchy. So
yes.
The laws, the decrees, and then ministerial orders. So ministerial orders can never go against decrees, never go against the law. So, and the constitution. So then after this, so it's maybe very different from countries where you have this other kind of law that is based on precedency. I don't know
precedence. Yeah. I know it's a hard word for us too.
Yes, in our case, we have to write everything in everything. So we have to write everything what we want to do. We have to write them down in laws, decrees, and ministerial orders. And this is then public policy making. But in Brazil, the energy sector is a very private one compared to other sectors. So for the sector to work, we have the Ministry of Mines and Energy designing the public policy and giving directives, but we have the regulatory agency for the power sector, the regulatory agency for the oil, gas, and biofuel sectors. We have the Energy Research Office, is more or less like the DOE in the States, where we have all the studies. So it's our technical arm. So when all the energy planning come from our Energy Research Office. We have the National System Operator, this big centralized operator of the whole system. And we also have our trading chamber, which is the institution who organized the wholesale market. So they work together. We have to work with all these institutions to make this sector.
And sorry, these are state-owned entities or they're private entities?
The chamber, the wholesale market, and the system operated are private ones. But the government may assign one of their directors, or one or two of their directors. And the regulatory agencies at the research office are public.
And so how does that work exactly? And maybe we can tie it back to you. You sit on a board, an oversight board of Petrobras, is that right?
Yes, because this is different then. So what happens is that the federal government controls several companies, and then in order to be present at their administrations, it can always what's the name? It can always suggest names for their boards.
I see.
So I have been in the board of directors sometimes, and sometimes in the board of what we call the oversight boards, or we call it here in Brazil, Conselho Fiscal. It's more or less like an audit committee. But the difference between an oversight board and an audit committee is that the audit committee is a part of the administration and responds to the board of directors, and the oversight board is not a part of the administration. It responds directly to the shareholders' assembly. So we are overseeing.
And who are the shareholders of Petrobras?
So there is the government of Brazil, but there are several minority shareholders
that are private entities as well.
It's a public listed company as well as Eletrobras.
Interesting. And are these international companies? Are these domestic? Who is this?
No, in fact, they are, I would say, not companies, but in fact, funds. So people from all over the world.
It's truly a public market. So it's freely exchange. You can buy into it. Okay, now I understand.
Public listed in Brazil, in several markets. So also, I think in Madrid, and I don't know, in the US, because I was previously from Eletrobras and now I'm from Petrobras. So I'm not sure which of the stock exchanges they are listed, but they are listed everywhere. So they have shareholders everywhere.
And then what is the current policy on foreign investment in the country in general? Is the country open to foreign investment?
It's always open. And I think this is a good, it's an agenda that has become more clear in this government, I would say. So there is a special secretary in the Ministry of Economics. It's called the Special Secretary for Private Investments, PPIs, and they are always doing road shows and showing what's going on in Brazil in the several sectors. And if you see in our constitution, we are not in Brazil allowed to to defer the treatment between foreigners and foreign companies and Brazilian companies. But of course, if they are doing business in Brazil and specifically dealing with concession rights, they have to open to have a company in Brazil as well. So like I don't know, an affiliation here in Brazil somewhere.
I see.
Yes.
And then what types of projects are good for foreign investment? Is it like so like for instance, new generating capacity? Would that be something where foreign investors would come in to like build a new thermal power plant?
That's what they are seeing. They always come at the beginning with the auctions. They started joint venturing with Eletrobras.
Yes.
To feel how it
makes
was.
sense because Eletrobras knows the sector better than anybody,
Yes.
right? It's like,
but since I don't know, for at least 10 years, they come here. We have so many companies in Brazil from everywhere, investors. And so power generation is a good business. Transmission is a very good business because it's really what we call, it's a regulated annual revenue base. So it's really, it's if they are very diligent in delivering what they promise in the projects, it's a very good business. And now when we think about the future, there are so many alternatives. We have been discussing a lot about hydrogen, about offshore wind. There are so many things going on.
Yes, tell me more about that. I want to hear about like especially technology innovation and how technology innovation might be coming to Brazil. And are you encouraging it, or are you just opening up to it, or how do you plan to bring new technologies into Brazil?
So what we see is that when I was talking about technological neutrality, I think that these auctions, they have also helped in attracting innovation, new technologies. For example, solar started participating in the auctions, and now we have solar everywhere, also in distributed generation. So this is a way. But then when we talk specifically about innovation, in Brazil, we have in the power sector and in the oil and gas sector, we have what we call the public and publicly oriented R&D resources. So concessionaires, people, power producers, distribution companies, and also concessionaires in the oil and gas sector, they have to invest a part of their revenues in R&D. And this investment is regulated by the regulatory agencies. And then we have, like, I would say, more or less 20 years of learning in this regulation of innovation through these regulatory investments, regulated investments. And then this year was the first year where the National Council for Energy Policy, is the board of ministers who advise the president on strategic issues on energy, published a resolution orientating the regulatory agencies to prioritize the regulation of these public and publicly oriented resources towards themes, technologies, or energy sources related to energy transition. And this is very interesting because in order to prioritize, we have to have data. And this was then a development from 2018, 2019 until today, that together with the international collaboration, we started designing a platform to collect data on innovation on in the energy sector as a whole. So this was done with, I think, with the International Energy Agency, the government of the UK, CEPAL, and several other bodies, and also with the Ministry of Science and Technology. And then through the outcomes of this first part of the project are 4 reports where they made a mapping and saw where there were where these resources were being concentrated. And usually in projects that were looking into short-term results and not really innovation, long-term results, usually in issues in the power sector, usually in issues related to the grid, for example. And this gave us some insights into looking for other areas that would be interesting for the country, aligned also with the directives that came from our 30-year energy plan, pointing out to disruptive technologies that will be important in the energy sector as well, like hydrogen, for example. So this was the thing. And then this work to map and get to know better where innovation is taking place in Brazil in the energy sector is moving forward. So I think next month, the Energy Research Office will launch the platform, the Innova-E, it's the name of the platform, where this data will be then publicly accessible.
Great, great. We're coming up on time here, so I just wanted to make sure that we're able to address any other issues that you might have wanted to bring up with our audience. What else is on your mind? What else do you see as important to the future of Brazil?
I think also for the future, we are talking a lot about decarbonization. And one thing that we see and we defend a lot in Brazil is that there is no one size fits all for energy transition, for decarbonization. And when we look into the net zero scenario by 2050 from the International Energy Agency, we see that biofuels will play an important role. So we are really pushing this agenda forward, showing how biofuels are important. We can not only talk about electrification. Of course, electrification is important, and Brazil is a very electrified country, so this is really not a problem for us. But when we think about energy transition, we talk about a lot about just transition, but we have to be accountable also in terms of inclusion. And when we think about other continents that don't have like a big grid like Brazil, for example, electrification will be much harder to obtain. And these countries, for example, we think about Africa, they have a lot of land, they have a lot of sun like we do, and they can easily move into another agenda, also fostering biofuels, and this will help them in their decarbonization strategies as well. So we are discussing this a lot. Brazil is taking part on this high-level dialogue on energy from the United Nations, and is one of the global champions in the theme of energy transition. So we are collaborating in this report that they are designing with all these countries about this theme. But then every country that takes part as a global champion is encouraged to present an energy compact, so an international voluntary commitment, and we presented two. One of them is in hydrogen and the other one is in biofuels. So we have a policy in Brazil, it's called the Renova Bio. It's a policy that aims at increasing the participation of the mix of biofuels in the fossil fuels for the transport sector. So we have specific targets and goals, and it's also designed to really address the decarbonization. So we design a financial instruments called the CBIOs that the fuel distribution companies have to buy in order to certify that they bought the biofuel. And then, so this policy, it's now an international commitment that we are signing, hoping to inspire other countries to also develop this agenda. So I think we have to think of all strategies that are on hand, and they are ones that are more easier on hand. And so when we talk about energy transition, we think that the countries have to recognize where they are starting from and which pathways are more cost effective for them to end at the decarbonization target where everybody wants to end at the end.
What an important note to end on. Agnes da Costa, thank you so much for taking the time today. This has been an amazing conversation and really appreciate you sharing your insight with us.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.